Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to today's program Nicholas Carretta, who is president of UltraShipTMS. And today we're going to talk about calculating the cost savings and return of a transportation management system. Now, this is a topic that came up in the last conversation that Nicholas and I had, where we were talking about barriers to TMS implementations, and building the business case was one of those things that came up on top. So today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that topic. But before we do, I just want to remind all of you that are joining us live today that part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this conversational and interactive. So as Nicholas and I are having our conversation here, if you have a question for him, you can go ahead and submit it via the question button or via the chat feature, and I'll keep an eye on that. And certainly, if it's a good question, appropriate question, and we have time to weave it in, I'll do so. I do want to remind you that if you are joining us as a visitor, you will have to sign in first in order to be able to ask a question. So with that, Nicholas, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Nicholas, like I said, in our last discussion, we talked about different barriers that companies face when implementing a TMS, and building the business case was one of the key things that you brought up, and so that's really what's kind of sparked us to kind of follow up and have this conversation today. The thing that I always find interesting is that, considering that TMS solutions have been around for so many years, and certainly there's so many case studies out there. I mean, why do so many companies still have a hard time building the business case for a TMS?
I think the biggest reason is because companies are very unique. Every supply chain is unique. Everybody's transportation model is a little bit unique. So for someone to go out there and say, well, the average savings for installing a TMS is 9%, 12%. People don't want to know what the average is. They want to know what I'm going to save. So I think one of the barriers is really being able to self-assess and to say, what am I going to save from this software? If you're going to build a business case, you want to take a look at your specific network, and then you want to figure out savings that are unique to you and not go off of average savings. And I think that's one of the barriers people face, is finding out specifically for them, how much am I going to save?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, you hear it all the time, with companies, with anything related to supply chain logistics. Everyone thinks that they're different, right? That their company is different, that they face unique challenges, that their operations are different. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what XYZ company saved, or even people listening to this, right? They say, well, I got to know for my company. I think I think you hit the nail on the head there. So kind of let's walk through the steps here. I mean, so how does a company get started? I mean, what's the first step to kind of try to build that business case?
Well, I think the first step is to be reflective, to do an accurate self-assessment of your supply chain and your transportation network. In order to do that self-assessment, you really have to take a look at factors such as your transportation spend. What am I spending on transportation? What are my staffing costs to execute my shipments every week, month, year? And then you really have to do an exercise where you map existing business processes, really come up with a good solid baseline of your network, and come up with a current state process map that explains what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, what are the challenges that you're facing on a day-to-day basis, and really self-realization and understanding your network, so that you can go out there and then say, okay, well, based on what I know about myself, now what can I expect to obtain as far as savings from this type of solution?
So you talked about, I mean, I heard two things there. One is kind of understand your costs. The other one is kind of understand your processes. So let's look at the cost first, because I think that's trying to create that baseline. I mean, I think that's what gets a lot of companies stuck, right? Because it's kind of the chicken and egg type of problem, right? It's one thing to say, okay, well, let's figure out what your transportation spend is, what your current costs are. But if you don't have a TMS, if you're using spreadsheets, if you're using manual processes, then determining those transportation costs, that baseline, is very difficult for many companies, right? So how do you, what do you see companies doing in terms of getting over that hump of just trying to create that baseline?
Well, how do they create the baseline? If they don't have existing systems in place, or they've got systems that are partially in place and they can't get the data, I mean, really what they have to do is come up with their best estimate. A lot of times you're going to have to go to different subject matter experts within the organization. You may have to talk to the guy that's doing inbound or outbound, the guy that's an LTL expert versus a truckload expert. And really what you have to do is create your best estimate at what your network looks like. When I run into these situations, and I'll get a call from somebody and they'll say, what are you using for software? What do you use for routing? And they'll tell me, Google Maps. All right, well, there's still people out there that do that. And when I see those opportunities, I realize that it typically indicates that there's a good amount of savings available to someone like that. There's a lot of automation that could be put in place with the transportation network, and there's a good amount of opportunity for them. What I'd say that they have to do is put together their best assessment, come up with that assessment, and then leverage a provider, someone like ourselves. It's not our first time doing this. It's not the first time we've heard that. We've gained a lot of experience over the years in helping people who are implementing a TMS but don't have the best idea of a baseline. So leverage an outside provider like ourselves, and we can provide you existing process maps for a future state. We can help you map out your current state, and then we can help you provide estimates that are going to be close enough that we can do a good implementation from there, and you could start getting the automation and the savings that you need to get.
One of the things that I've seen, some companies do is really looking at their just their invoices. Trying to collect the invoices that they've gotten over the years, over the course of a year from their various operations. Whether they're doing those payments in house or working with a third-party freight payment, provider, and try to use that data as kind of a starting point. I mean, do you see companies doing that as well?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Going off of invoice data is a very common way of doing it. A lot of times they're working with a third-party freight payment company, and they can get the information from them, or they can get it in-house. But even then, I do see people that do that, and I do see people that can't even do it with that kind of information, or they can do it for one of the modes of transportation. Like they say, I can provide it for truckload, but I really don't have visibility for LTL to that kind of data, or for parcel or something like that. But yeah, going off of invoice data, that's definitely one way of doing it. Anything that you can do to provide volume or spend or any combination of the two is just going to give us some kind of baseline to understand really how you want to size the solution, and then what kind of savings you can get from that type of solution. But again, if they don't have that information, it generally indicates that there's more savings available rather than less. So they're in a good position, at least in that aspect.
Right. I mean, I think there's no way around it. I mean, you really have to, if you haven't been using a TMS, and if you're dealing primarily with manual processing, I mean, you just have to roll up your sleeves, see what data is there, cleanse it, and then, to your point, leverage, partners such as yourselves to try to fill in those gaps with, based on your experience and your knowledge and what you see other companies doing, to try to create that baseline as well as possible. So, once you create that best baseline, I assume the next step is really then trying to, see where the potential savings can come from. Where do those TMS savings come from?
So a common question I hear probably twice a week, how much can I expect to save? What's realistic savings estimates for this type of solution? What we've done is, because we get the question asked so often, we wrote a white paper on the topic, and we built an online savings calculator. And using the white paper as a reference point, and then the savings calculator, we've come up with 8 buckets of transportation savings that people can expect 8 areas of transportation savings where people can expect savings. So those 8 buckets are a combination of our experience from over the years of doing TMS implementation, and then also independent third-party results that have validated these assumptions. For us, it was important not just to make claims based on our software and what we know, but to validate those claims through other third-party sources. In doing that, we came up with the 8 buckets, and for us, the 8 buckets are better routing, improved payload, mode selection, better use of preferred carriers, better procurement negotiations, better payment accuracy, better communications, not just with carriers, but with sales staff, customer service, and customers, and then better business intelligence. So within those 8 categories, those are where you're going to find your savings, coming up with that baseline, and then figuring out where you fit in those 8 categories as far as the self-assessment. That'll provide you a pretty good idea of what you can expect to save using a TMS and an optimization tool.
It seems like it's a pretty comprehensive set of buckets, if you will, potential savings buckets that are out there, and certainly the 8 that you mentioned are kind of aligned with the research that I've done as well over the years in terms of where I've seen companies benefit from a TMS. And from a high level, you can group them into kind of optimization related benefits and kind of execution related benefits. Which tend to drive greater savings, optimization or execution, from your experience?
I hate to be redundant in my answer, but everybody's very unique. So you look at a specific organization, and that based on their transportation network, somebody with a higher order frequency and a smaller order size is generally going to benefit more from an optimizer, whereas somebody who has a lower volume of shipments and a larger average order size might benefit less. One of the things that we found with the optimizer, it's easier to quantify the savings. So you'll take the data, you'll load it up, you'll have a before and an after, and you can then say, well, here was my shipping cost before optimization, here were the costs after the optimization. And it's a very clear, hard savings that you can come up with an optimizer. That being said, everybody won't benefit from the optimizer to the same degree, and that's part of what we do with the savings calculators. We break the savings into optimization savings, which are the better routing and improved payload, and then the execution savings. And then we can look at either optimization or execution based on what's right for that specific customer.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I think you see cases where companies always ship full truckloads. There's a pretty static environment, and it's really more in those type of situations. Generally speaking, you see greater benefit or the low-hanging fruit being just automating the tendering, the execution, and just making sure that the preferred carriers are being used more often, so on and so forth. Whereas to your point, I mean, a lot of companies could also benefit if their trailer loads aren't as optimized, and kind of leaving a lot of money on the table there by not combining some of those loads. So I think the argument always is, well, where do you start, right? Do you start with optimization? You start with execution? I think I know the answer based on what you just said right now, but how do you determine where you should start? Whether do you go the optimization route or the execution route?
Well, so what we do with the calculator is that we allow everybody to self-assess in those 8 categories and grade themselves from best in class to worst in class in the different buckets. So we take the results from that assessment, and then we look at things like the data availability. When you go back to the previous question you mentioned, what if someone doesn't know their transportation spend? What if they don't know their shipment volume? Well, I would say that's not a candidate to start with optimization at that point. You really, for a good optimization, you need to have good data, and you have to have good inputs of data so that you can get value out of the optimization. So in looking at an organization, if an organization doesn't have the data in order to do the assessment, they're probably not going to be a candidate for optimization first. You'd probably want to do execution first at that point, because execution is going to drive better data capture. That's going to give you the business intelligence to then go back and build an optimization model that's going to create savings. So it's going to depend on the individual organization, their shipping profiles as to whether or not they're going to benefit from optimization in general, and then the amount of data that they have available to them and the quality of the data that they have available. So when you look at factors like that, then you can say, okay, optimization would be first or execution would be first, and you have to find the solution that's right for an individual.
That's great. That's a great point about data quality in terms of building that history, if you will, and having confidence in the data that you have in order to be able to then fully, more fully take advantage of optimization capabilities. I mean, in your experience, with the customers that you work with, does it tend to be more of what you just said? Kind of people starting off with execution first, just because they don't have that baseline data to take advantage of optimization.
I get a combination. People that have no system in place, and this is the first system they're going to put in, they'll typically go for execution first. If I have somebody that I'm working with that's looking to upgrade an existing system or migrate away from a solution that's not working for them, a lot of time the data will be of good enough quality that we can cleanse it and get it cleaned up to the point that it's usable in an optimization, and you may do the optimization first. Or you may do optimization and execution at the same time if they're at that level that they can accommodate something like that. But for a first time, you probably want to do execution first, get the communications down. It doesn't make sense to build the perfect truckload through an optimization and then not being able to execute on it, right? Because you'll never get the savings that you're predicting. So a lot of times I'll recommend execution first and then optimization at a later date. Other factors, though, that are going to come into play are whether or not you're looking at inbound or outbound, and what level of order data that they're going to be able to transmit over as well. So again, I don't want to stay on the middle of the fence and not go one way or another, but you really have to take it case by case and look at the strengths and the weaknesses of a potential shipper in order to figure out what's going to be best for them.
No, yeah, I mean, I think it just goes back to your opening comment, that in terms of why it's so difficult to build a business case, because it's the classic consultant answer, right? It depends. Depends on the specific situation of that client and where they're at and what stage in the maturity they're at. So now let's talk about kind of the calculating the payback and the ROI, which at the end of the day is what every CEO, every CFO, wants to know. What are the factors that go into, the ROI and payback calculation?
Well, it's the factors that we talked about. We break it into three parts. We want to take the transportation spend and the volume of shipments. We'll take a look at current staffing and processes. What are you spending on an annual basis in overhead for staff and management of the shipments? And then we want to look at those categories and figure out, okay, based on each of those categories, how much am I going to save in transportation spend? How much am I going to save in staffing costs, or how much more efficient can my staff be to possibly work on other things within the organization? And then you want to build your savings estimate. So from those three components, we can come up with a pretty solid baseline estimate. And then to finish out the calculation, you're going to want to know the cost of the potential solution, what it's going to cost to implement and maintain the solution. Once you have those components, we can create a payback calculation. We'll look at a reasonable estimate for how long you think, or how long we think it will take you to get up to speed and get proficient on the solution, so that then you can determine how soon can I expect the savings to pay for the expense or the investment in the TMS software.
In that calculation, when you look at the TMS software, there's a variety of different solutions out there and a variety of different deployment models and pricing models. So that's another factor that obviously goes into the play, right? So if you're using or if you're considering a software as a service solution, that's going to have certain cost factors and considerations there, not only just on the software side, but maybe the IT side as well and support side, versus, if you're going to implement a more traditional in-house, implementation. Kind of what are the differences there between, let's say, a SaaS solution versus a traditional, in-house implementation, and how that factors into the payback?
Okay, definitely a point many would probably want to argue with me, depending on which side of the fence they are, what solution they offer. As a rule of thumb, what I would say is that a traditionally licensed software package, there are going to be more upfront licensing fees. It's going to take a little bit longer to recoup your investment than using a SaaS solution. With SaaS, you should anticipate a quicker payback. You'll be able to minimize your upfront cost by stretching the licensing fees over a longer term. Traditional software, you also have to count hardware costs, IT support staff. So overall, we find that the SaaS model provides a quicker payback and provides a quicker ROI than a traditionally licensed software.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for a few years now, I think that's been a lot of discussion around software as a service, and in general, not only TMS, but in other applications. Certainly, it's been a model that's been, greatly adopted in the TMS space, and it's no secret that I'm a huge proponent of the software as a service model, not only for the time to benefit and the cost benefits, but also some of the network-based benefits that come, such as network-based business intelligence analytics that TMS software as a service providers can provide. Before I go on my next question, I see that we've got a question here from Joe, so I'm going to go ahead and put it up on the screen here for us to read. It says, ask Nick to comment on interaction of finance with supply chain on a TMS purchase. Challenges, any watch-outs?
Well, I mean, that's working with finance is always the challenge. Getting the CFO to, take the cap off the pen and actually sign and make the spend is difficult. I think what you have to do in those situations is make sure that you have realistic examples of what the savings are, and then have specifics within the certain categories that are going to drive those savings. So just to say, well, payment accuracy is going to give me 2% savings. Well, okay, but what specifically? How are you going to get that 2% savings within better payment accuracy? Is it going to be through using paperless invoicing? Is it going to be through better accessorial management? I mean, you really have to understand what are the hot buttons that get every CFO. They don't like hearing, well, transportation costs are going up again this year. They want to know why they're going up. What are we doing to combat those kinds of costs? And interacting with the CFO is really to make a good business case for him, in which he can not only see those savings, but have examples of how you're going to obtain the savings in those categories, and then give him a realistic payback. If I'm going to write a check for the TMS, if I'm going to spend some money on implementation and I'm going to dedicate resources to it, what can I expect my transportation spend to go to? How much savings can I get? And it's making that business case with numbers. You got to make the case with numbers. What I always also have found with the CFO and the finance people is business intelligence. When you can open up the TMS and within 3 or 4 clicks, you can show them what their freight accruals are. You can show them what they spent last week in line haul, what they spent in fuel, what their accessorials are costing. And you can break that down by customer or by plant or division. And it only takes a couple seconds. They try to hold back, but their eyes start to open up. They start to grin a little bit, and then they know they want it. And so making the sale to the C-suite, the CFO specifically, it's really about providing the visibility to the numbers and the financials. And when you can show them how easy they can get access to the underlying data and how easy it is to calculate these things like what they spent and what their accruals are, that's what really starts to help sell this. And those are things that you should be able to do with any good TMS solution.
Great, Joe. Great question, and which kind of it was going to be my next question. I think you just answered it, but I'll ask it anyway in case you want to add anything to it. Which was, you've done all this work, right? You've created you've gotten the baseline. You've kind of figured out where the savings are going to come from. You kind of done the calculation. I mean, how do you best present it, to upper management, to the CEO, the CFO, to get their buy-in ultimately, which every transportation logistics executive ultimately needs to get to make an investment and get some support in doing this type of deployment.
Right. So that's the challenge. You have to put a deck together, and you have to sit in front of the capital committee or the steering committee, whatever it might be, and you have to build a business case. So part of that business case is taking those process maps that we talked about earlier, making sure you have a map of your current state solution, mapping out what you anticipate the future state to be, using the savings estimates and then mapping them back to specific areas within that future state as to where you're going to get those savings. Make sure you're able to provide answers in each of those categories that are specifics, not just generalizations. Use our white paper that's on our website to help validate those assumptions. What we've done in the white paper is walk you through a specific case study of a fictional shipper that shows you what their staffing, what their level of spend was before implementing a solution, and then how they were able to reduce that spend and better utilize the staff. And it walks you through step by step in a true business case of getting ROI out of a TMS. Once you've done that, the other thing you really have to do is set a realistic timeline. You're not going to get savings on day one, so you have to have a good anticipation of when you'll start to see those savings and a way to track those savings. And what I would suggest is if you're not able to do that to the level you're comfortable with, again, leverage someone like ourselves to help collaborate on something like that. We often get called in those situations where someone says, okay, I know I want a TMS. I've used it at another company that I worked at. I have to sell it in here. Can you help me sell it in? And sure, we'd love to do that. One other option I would suggest is third-party consultants. We've worked with several of them over the last few years where if people aren't able to sell it in on their own, they'll bring a consulting group in or a consultant. That consultant has a lot of experience. There are people that specialize in specifically TMS and transportation software implementations, and they can provide a lot of value in a situation like this.
Great advice. I mean, and just going back to Joe's question, particularly with the CFO and finance, what I find is that, being able to put the value proposition into the language that they understand, I think is highly, important. They may not understand or see the value of, improved, on-time delivery, improving it from, 94% to 96%. But if you can put it in the metrics that kind of align with the P&L and balance sheet, that gets their attention, because those are the metrics that, they, can sink their teeth into, right? So if it's about cash flow, if it's about working capital, if you can make those connections of how a TMS can help cash flow and working capital, as an example, I think that has a great impact as well.
I agree very much. You have to speak their language, and one thing I'll always say, and hopefully there's no CFOs watching right now, but they tend to think transportation is a commodity, and that it's all things being equal, you can always buy it cheaper because you're commoditizing it, and that's not always the case. So the TMS will often help you, make that example and prove that case, but also show exactly where the costs are within the network, how short lead time maybe affects transportation spend, and how something that is happening upstream to an order is creating a downstream effect of higher transportation costs. Having the TMS in place can show that quite often, and you have to be able to make that business case in their language, in that financial language, in order to get the approval for something like this.
Yeah, great point. We got another question from Joe, so I'm going to go ahead and put it up on the air, and let's read it together. With a SaaS deployment, how much time does a client's internal IT group need to be involved? Many IT departments are stretched. Do internal IT departments have a bias against a SaaS solution? Very traditional solution where the client hosts the software. So yeah, so how much internal IT support is required with SaaS, and is there a bias internally kind of against SaaS solutions versus doing something in-house?
So what we'll do is, as part of our estimate, when we provide an estimate, we have estimates of how much time each individual person at the client organization is going to have to spend on an implementation. So during the implementation, you'll have to have someone on the IT staff that's going to manage integration points, that's going to help you set up the EDI connections and the file transfers, the master data transfers. There is a good amount of work that they do up front, but once the solution is installed, the amount of involvement they have decreases drastically. Another thing with the SaaS solution is we provide all the support. So we become that first line of defense for low-level support questions, training, things like along those lines that are going to minimize the IT staff's involvement. So early on, you'll be required to provide IT resources to the project to help with the integrations, but after the kickoff of the project, that decreases significantly throughout the life of the software solution. Now, the second half of the question, could you refresh me on that?
So the second half, he basically asked is if internal IT departments have a bias against SaaS solutions versus traditional solutions where they deployed it themselves?
I've seen both. I've seen attitudes changing quite a bit over the last few years. When you go in and you can explain some of the other benefits to SaaS, when you can show an IT provider or an IT person that using the SaaS has built-in redundancies and actually aids in a disaster recovery plan that they would put together, when you show them how the system has 99.9% uptime and is reliable, and you provide them those assurances, they start to warm up to it. I do run into sometimes resistance, but those are resistances that we face all the time, and we have ways of convincing them, helping them understand that there are more benefits to the SaaS model than disadvantages, and they're going to have their typical concerns, such as like data ownership, access to the data, redundancies, permissions, securities. But over the last 13 years, we've developed a good platform, as have most SaaS providers, and those are becoming less and less of a concern as we move forward.
Yeah, great question, Joe. Thank you very much again for asking that question. And I think Nicholas, same. I echo the same thing you just said right there. And I think for a lot of IT departments, they've got their hands full with a lot of other types of internal IT work. And if this means less work for them, over the long term, because they've got their hands full with other initiatives that they're working on. As long as you meet those those very valid concerns that they might have, particularly with security and business continuity and things, and data ownership and things like that. As long as they feel comfortable that you're addressing their needs, I think the environment has become much more favorable. They've become much more accepting of this model. We're running short on time here, so I'm going to get to my last question here, Nicholas. And you referenced the white paper and the kind of the online calculator that you've recently put on your website. And for the most part, kind of they deal with what I would consider kind of hard costs, right, and the hard savings that are involved with the TMS that are relatively easier to quantify. But there are a lot of quote unquote soft benefits associated with the TMS too. What are some of those soft benefits, and how important are they in the business case?
I'd say that they're important in the business case, but we wouldn't recommend selling in or trying to get support just on the soft benefits. That's why we've tried to focus on the hard benefits. There are so many soft benefits that you can talk about with the TMS: improved on-time delivery, better visibility, faster reaction to exceptions, better carrier and driver satisfaction, better ability to collaborate between both internal and external stakeholders. There are a lot of soft benefits, but putting a number on those, how do you say that better carrier satisfaction, or becoming that quote-unquote shipper of choice, or having a happier driver because he's running better routes? It's tough to quantify those things. I mean, what your driver turnover rate is. That average driver costs, I think they just announced, went up 2 cents per mile in the last quarter. So there are benefits there, but quantifying those in the sale, and again, I don't think the CFO wants to hear about the soft benefits. He wants to know, how am I going to reduce cost? If I add this expense, what's the offset? How does that improve my earnings, improve our profitability, and keep costs down? And that's why, like you said, we focus on the hard benefits, but there are plenty of soft benefits to installing a TMS.
Well, with that, Nicholas, we've run out of time here. Certainly, it's been a very interesting and valuable conversation. As I always say every week, we always just manage to scratch the surface on these things. So I'm sure that we can probably keep talking for another hour or so on this whole topic. But thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Well, Adrian, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And Joe, thank you for the questions. I appreciate the dialogue today. Thank you.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Joe, for the questions. And if you're watching this on demand and you do have a question for Nicholas around this topic, go ahead to the website, talkinglogistics.com, and find this episode and post a question or a comment there for Nicholas, and I'm sure that he'll be happy to respond via that platform. Again, thank you very much for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.